The Hexagon Forged. The Birth of France. Introduction. The Land and the Lineage. Look at a map of Europe today, and your eyes will naturally settle on a nearly perfect geometric shape, the hexagon. It is a land defined by the rugged Atlantic coast, the sun-drenched Mediterranean, the towering white peaks of the Alps, and the jagged Pyrenees. To the modern eye, France looks inevitable. It looks like it was always meant to be there. But history is not a straight line, and nations are not born by accident. 2,000 years ago, there was no France. There was only a wild, fractured territory the Romans called Gaul. It was a mosaic of hundreds of tribes, a land of deep forests and sacred rivers, inhabited by a people who were masters of iron and spirit, yet incapable of standing together. The story of how this fractured landscape became the most centralized, culturally dominant nation in Europe is a story of blood, iron, and a series of miracles that defied the odds of time. To understand France, we must go back to the moment the first lines were drawn in the soil. We must go back to the collision of three worlds: the Celtic, the Roman, and the Germanic. Part 1. The Celtic Soul and the Roman Hammer. Long before the French language was a whisper, the Celts, the Gauls, dominated this land. They were not barbarians in the way Hollywood portrays them. They were sophisticated goldsmiths, fierce warriors, and philosophical druids. But they were tribal. An Arverni tribesman from the Central Highlands felt no kinship with the Parisi from the banks of the Seine. This disunity was a dinner invitation to Julius Caesar. In 58 BC, Caesar marched his legions across the Alps. His goal wasn't just conquest, it was political survival in Rome. For 8 years, he systematically dismantled the Gallic tribes. But in the final hour, a young chieftain named Vercingetorix did the impossible. He united the warring tribes under a single banner of resistance. At the Siege of Alesia, the fate of the land hung in the balance. Vercingetorix stood atop the ramparts, watching as Caesar's engineers built a wall around his wall, a masterpiece of Roman cruelty and discipline. When Vercingetorix finally rode out to surrender, throwing his weapons at Caesar's feet, the Celtic dream of independence died. But, in its place, something new was born: Gallo-Roman culture. For 500 years, Gaul was the jewel of the Roman Empire. The Romans didn't just occupy the land, they paved it. They built the roads that still lie beneath modern French highways. They built the cities, Lyon, Nîmes, Arles, and a small muddy settlement called Lutetia, which would one day be Paris. Most importantly, they brought two things that would define France forever: the Latin language, which would slowly soften and warp into French, and a new, radical religion from the East: Christianity. By the time the Roman Empire began to collapse under its own weight in the 5th century, Gaul was no longer a collection of tribes. It was a Christian, Latin-speaking province waiting for a new master. Part 2. The Baptism of the Franks. As the Roman light flickered out, a storm blew in from the east. Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Vandals, and the Burgundians, poured across the Rhine. But one tribe would give the land its name: the Franks. The Franks were free men, fierce warriors known for the Francisca, a deadly throwing axe. But they weren't just raiders, they were looking for a home. In 481, a teenager named Clovis became king of the Salian Franks. He was ruthless, brilliant, and remarkably pragmatic. Clovis realized a fundamental truth: you can conquer a land with an axe, but you cannot rule a people who hate you. The Gallo-Romans were Christians. Clovis was a pagan. In 496, legend says that during a desperate battle, Clovis cried out to the god of his wife, Clotilde, promising to convert if he won. He won. In the Cathedral of Rheims, Clovis was baptized. This was the first great founding moment of France. By becoming a Catholic, Clovis forged a holy alliance between the Frankish military and the church. He wasn't just a barbarian king anymore, he was the right hand of God. From that day forward, the kings of France would be crowned at Rheims, anointed with holy oil, a tradition that would last for over 1,000 years. Clovis founded the Merovingian dynasty. He unified the Frankish tribes and expanded his borders, creating a kingdom that roughly resembled the France we know today. But the Merovingians were plagued by a fatal flaw. They viewed the kingdom as personal property, dividing it among their sons until it dissolved into a bloody mess of civil wars. The crown grew weak, and the do-nothing kings faded into the background. In their shadow, a new family of mayors of the palace rose to take the reins. Part 3. The Emperor and the Divorce. In the 8th century, a giant appeared on the stage of history. Charlemagne, Charles the Great. Charlemagne was a man of immense physical presence and even greater ambition. He spent his long reign in the saddle, leaping from one frontier to the next. He crushed the Saxons, crossed the Pyrenees, and pushed into Italy. On Christmas Day, 800 AD, in Rome, the Pope crowned him Holy Roman Emperor. Charlemagne's empire was vast. It covered modern France, Germany, and half of Italy. He brought a Carolingian Renaissance, building schools and standardizing the script we use to write today. But was he French? Not quite. He spoke a Germanic dialect and kept his capital in Aachen, in modern-day Germany. The birth of France, specifically, happened after his death. Charlemagne's grandsons could not get along. In 843, they met at Verdun to slice the empire into 3 pieces. The eastern part would become Germany. The middle strip would eventually vanish into history. But the western part, Francia Occidentalis, was the embryo of France. For the first time, a specific territory was carved out that was distinct from the Germanic lands to the east. The divorce of 843 created the border that would be fought over for the next 1,100 years. Part 4. The Capetian Miracle. By the late 10th century, the Carolingian line had run dry. The land was a chaos of Viking raids and local warlords who retreated into stone castles and ignored the king. In 987, the great nobles gathered to elect a new king. They chose a man they thought was weak, Hugh Capet. Hugh Capet owned very little. His kingdom was essentially a small patch of land around Paris and Orleans. The great dukes of Normandy and Aquitaine were far more powerful than he was. They mocked him. They asked, "Who made you king?" He replied, "Who made you duke?" But Hugh Capet had one thing his rivals didn't: the Capet miracle. For 300 years, every single Capetian king produced a male heir. While other dynasties collapsed into succession crises, the Capetians just kept going. Slowly, generation by generation, they expanded. They were like a slow-moving glacier. They used the law, they used marriage, they used the church to claw back power from the nobles. They turned Paris from a muddy island into the intellectual and spiritual capital of Europe. Then came Philippe Auguste, Philip II. Before Philippe, the rulers were called King of the Franks. Philippe was the first to call himself King of France. He was a master of administration and a ruthless soldier. His greatest rival was the King of England, who at the time owned more of France than Philippe did. In 1214, at the Battle of Bouvines, Philippe faced a massive coalition of English, German, and Flemish forces. It was a battle for the very existence of the French crown. Philippe won a crushing victory. As he returned to Paris, the people didn't just cheer for a warlord, they cheered for their king. Bouvines was the birth certificate of the French state. Part 5: The Hundred Years Apocalypse. But the greatest test was yet to come. In the 14th century, the miracle finally failed. The last Capetian king died without a son. The King of England, Edward III, claimed the French throne, sparking the Hundred Years' War. This wasn't just a war, it was an apocalypse. It was the era of the Black Death, which wiped out half the population. It was the era of the longbow, where French knights were slaughtered by English peasants at Crécy and Agincourt. By 1420, France was a broken nation. The English occupied Paris. The French king, Charles VII, was a dauphin in exile, hiding in the Loire Valley, doubting his own legitimacy. France was about to disappear from the map. And then, from a tiny village in the east, came a teenage girl who claimed to hear the voices of saints, Joan of Arc. She didn't lead with military strategy. She led with pure, unadulterated conviction. She convinced the Dauphin to give her an army, and she marched on the besieged city of Orleans. In her white armor, she became the living symbol of the French soul. She did something no king had been able to do. She made the peasants and the soldiers feel like they belonged to a nation called France. The English burned her at the stake, thinking they were killing a rebel. Instead, they created a martyr. Joan's death unified the French spirit. The English were driven out, and for the first time, the French people were no longer just subjects of a lord. They were defenders of a motherland. Part 6: The Spider and the Sun. The war was over, but the work of building a nation was not. The feudal world of knights and castles was dying. The man who buried it was Louis XI, known as the Universal Spider. Louis XI didn't like battles. He liked bribes, spies, and diplomacy. He sat in his small, dark rooms and spun a web that trapped the last of the great independent dukes. He absorbed Burgundy. He absorbed Brittany. By the time he was done, the hexagon was nearly complete. He created the first modern postal system. He created a standing army. He laid the tracks for absolute power. 2 centuries later, that power would reach its zenith in the person of Louis XIV, the Sun King. Louis XIV realized that to truly rule France, he had to break the spirit of the nobility once and for all. He built Versailles, a palace of such overwhelming golden splendor that it served as a gilded cage. He forced the nobles to leave their fortified castles and live under his eye, competing for the honor of holding his shirt in the morning. "L'état c'est moi," he famously said. "I am the state." Under the Sun King, France became the undisputed cultural and military superpower of the world. French became the language of diplomacy, of science, and of high society from St. Petersburg to Lisbon. The identity that began with a Gallic chieftain, was baptized with a Frankish king, and was saved by a peasant girl, was now solidified into a magnificent, centralized machine. Conclusion: The enduring hexagon. The French Revolution would eventually come to sweep away the kings. The guillotine would fall, and the Republic would be born. But the revolutionaries didn't destroy the France the kings had built, they perfected it. They took the centralized state of Louis XIV and gave it to the people. Today, when you walk the streets of Paris or look out over the vineyards of Bordeaux, you are seeing the result of 2,000 years of stubborn survival. France was not an accident of geography. It was a conscious creation. It was carved out of the forest by Roman engineers, defended by Frankish axes, prayed for by medieval monks, and drummed into existence by a girl from Domremy. It is a nation built on the idea that culture, language, and a shared history can overcome any border. The hexagon remains a monument to the long, bloody, and beautiful struggle to become France.